Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining my presentation. I guess there are many more interesting things to do. You chose this one, so appreciate it, very grateful for it. My name is Rafal Krzemianowski, and today, on behalf of ALTEN, I will be presenting and will try to give you at least a broad overview of what cybersecurity is, or should I say, what are cybersecurity controls. I have a feeling that controls in cybersec are a topic that most frequently omitted. Not everybody knows what it is and how it can help your organization. Just to give you a quick overview of what's my background. So my background is in cyber warfare, and on behalf of ALTEN and courtesy of ALTEN, I'm working for one of the biggest banks in the world, where we are trying to implement and uplift our control environment. That being said, let me give you an overview of what's ahead of us, what I want to say. So first, I would like to open with what's cyberspace and business, because as it turns out, cyberspace is not commonly understood. Some take it as something ephemeric. The other take it as something really embedded in software and hardware, and that's it. So I think that couple of opening remarks on what cyberspace would be really in place, and I would like to show you what is or what are the touching points between cyberspace and business. This will allow me to give you a couple of remarks on cybersecurity and what are the risks in cyberspace, how those risks deviate from cyber and from touch points that cyber has with business. This will allow me to set the ground to introduce the notion of controls in cyberspace. How can they be uplifted? What is the life cycle of controls in the organization? Just so that I will close this presentation with benefits or a quick overview of benefits that are resulting from implementing your controls in your cyberspace. Of course, I would like to say also a couple of things about what can be the next step when managing your controls in cyberspace. Of course, during the entire presentation, just feel free to raise concerns, questions. Really feel free to do it. Okay, let's kick off. First, as said, I wanted to just give you a quick overview of what's cyber, because as mentioned, there is no one notion of cyber, right? Everybody takes it a different way. So cyberspace, the notion itself, well, it derivates from ancient Greek, right? Cyber means to navigate. And in a couple of senses, because kybernao means to navigate a ship. But then again, it was used also metaphorically as to navigate yourself, to steer yourself with a proper mindset, with a proper rules, right? So at the very outset, at the very beginning, cyber meant to steer something, to govern. And the notion itself, it became most famous of 1984, William Gibson's Neuromancer. And I'm sure that many of you who are familiar with cybersecurity already heard about Gibson and Neuromancer and how the cybersecurity was used then. I don't know whether you've read it, but Gibson described cyberspace as somewhat something that we understand by the notion. So the main character of the novel is moving or acting in a sort of artificial reality, which was called cyberspace. By the way, I think that the notion itself was coined in 1960s or something by a couple of artists, but again, most famous, the notion is from William Gibson's novel. All right, so as mentioned, there's no clear and mutual understanding of what's cyber, right? I've browsed and through many different documents, and nowadays people try to baseline the common understanding and try to reach the common understanding. So I've found a couple of definitions. Two of them are gonna be presented from ISO guide, and two of them are not basically the same definition, but will give you the gist of what should be understood by cyberspace. So first of the definition is that cyberspace is a global domain within the information environment consisting of the independent network of information systems, infrastructures, including the internet, telecommunication networks, computer systems, and embedded processors and controllers. Just wanting to point out that please notice that cyberspace in this tag is sort of an underset of is a smaller piece of the information environment, right? So ISO wants to treat cyberspace as a piece of, so what they are saying is basically there's an information environment, and within this environment we have cyberspace, which consists of internet, system networks, computers, and so on and so forth, right? The second definition, and this is a newer one, points out that, in fact, cyberspace is independent network of information technology, infrastructures, and includes the internet, telecommunication networks, computer systems, and embedded processors and controllers in critical industries. Now, the notion of critical industries is being highlighted here for a purpose. I mean, just a link, and just to show you that this notion of this understanding of cyberspace actually links us to the notion of providing security in a broader domain, that is in critical industries. I bet you've all heard about critical industries, all those pipelines, right, banking industries, and so on and so forth. But this is deliberate. Critical industries in cyberspace, this piece here is deliberate. So just having these two tags in mind, we can safely assume that cyberspace may be characterized as a conglomerate, as a domain which consists of internet, information, systems, people, and services. And all those pieces here, again, have a meaning. They are critical parts of what cyberspace is, or may be. Now, having these pieces in place, we can try to guess or try to indicate of what are the touching points between cyberspace and business, because as it stands, cyber has, and this is, again, this is a triviality, right? But cyber inflicts effects on real-world objects, right? Through information, through systems, through people. Now, let's try to wonder of what business is. Or again, it is kind of trivial to say, but just for the sake of argument, we can sensibly assume that a business is every type of organized human action that is which's goal is to gain profits, right? To gain profits, be that material or financial profits or any other else for the matter. We can find in the resources, in the network, we can find many different definitions of what is business, what are organizations. Just for the sake of argument, let's assume that every business, every organization has its internal environment and an external environment, right? The internal one, well, these are all the financial capabilities, marketing, operation capabilities, personnel management, right? When it comes to external ones, we've got your customers, your products, your competitors, your suppliers. Then we've got the micro scale of your environment, which is socio-cultural environment, political environment, economic, technological, you name it. Basically, very broad definition of an external environment within which a corporation operates. Where's cyber? Where's cyber in this piece, in this diagram? Well, as I mentioned before, I think cyberspace runs through the every layer of this model, through every layer of the environment within which company operates. Why? Because cyber, as we said, these are the systems, these are the people, this is internet, technologies, this is everything, values, information, right? And because of that, cyber has many touching points with business and every organization or every possible layer. That being said, we can safely assume that on the touching point between cyber and business, there are risks. Why? Because both cyber and business have assets, and it's commonly phrased that assets have appetite for risks. And again, assets here are treated very broadly. Asset may be your servers, your networks, your technology, your customers, even your people. And I don't know if you guys remember, but Kevin Mitnick, the guy who wrote The Art of Deception, when he was, okay, just a side thought. Art of Deception, where Mitnick described how he used social engineering in order to perform hacks, right? He was targeting people. The only asset or the biggest risk factor in cyber, people. But that aside, let's take a look of what needs to be considered as a cybersecurity risk, given what we've just said. So again, you will find multiple definitions of what's a cybersecurity risk, what's a risk for that matter. But let's stay consistent and let's look at ISO guide and see what they are describing as a cybersecurity risk. So a risk is an effect of an uncertainty on or within information and technology. Cybersecurity risks relate to the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, data, or information, or control in brackets, right? Systems and reflect the potential adverse impact to organizational operation and assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation. Remember how I highlighted in the definition of cyberspace that it's also somewhat connected to critical infrastructure. Please notice that the last piece of this definition mentions nation. Again, it's a linkage to cyber warfare, which I don't want to talk about right now, but just want to highlight that the current state of understanding what's cybersecurity, and what are the risks, it enlarges, it extends, it tries to encompass more than just technologies, more than just something intangible like information itself. It goes beyond just to say, okay, it's also critical infrastructure and the nation. Right. So that sets the ground of the scope we are operating with right now, right? So we've got cyberspace, many touching points with business. These touching points are associated with risk, and on the cross of cyber and business, there's the place where risk occurs. Now, let's focus a little bit more on the organization itself, and since it operates in such a complex environment, from the control perspective, it needs to be mentioned that there is something like that, there's something called a risk profile or a risk posture. So, of course, every organization wants to stay in control, right? The purpose of building an organization is to gain your profits, but in a controlled manner, right? You don't want to just act, you want to act accordingly. You want to act in a structured way. You want to act and having at the same time a control. So when developing a risk profile for the organization itself must be aware of what is its strategy, or a business objective, right? We don't want to act like freely. We need to know what is our goal, where we are headed. Then again, we need to know what are our performance targets, right? When we're going to get there, how we are going to get there. And of course, acceptable variances and in performance. Then again, we need to know what is our risk capacity and appetite for the entity. I will focus a little bit more on that piece in a second. Again, in that regard, we need to also know what's the severity of the risk to be achieved of the strategy and business objective. That all being said, it brings us to one thing. Risk profile. When setting up your controls, you need to consider your risk profile, which is the totality of risk every organization is facing. Just imagine big organizations having multiple touch points with cyber, operating in various environments. Just imagine the abundance of those risks that are pertaining or are within the scope of the organization. And the totality of those risks is called a risk profile or a risk posture. Again, this is something that needs to be managed. And it will become a little bit clearer what I'm mentioning risk posture in a second. So when saying about risks in the organization and a risk profile of the organization, we need to mention two things. And actually both of them were mentioned under the third bullet point. So risk appetite and a risk tolerance. So basically, and in the plain words, risk appetite is the level of risk, number of risk that you want to have and you are willing to take within your organization, right? So among those abundance of those risks, there are some that you are willing to take and just say, okay, let's do it. I'm aware, and I accept the consequences. Then again, risk tolerance is the acceptable deviation from organization's risk appetite. So, okay, there's this our appetite, and then we are aware that something exceeds or is somewhat beyond our risk appetite, and we are able or we are willing to tolerate this delta. And of course, there's this unacceptable area of risk that you don't want to take. Let's just keep in mind these couple of definitions. Let me show you what a risk profile or a risk posture may look like in a big organization. This is just a graph, but please be advised how this may get complicated. So you can have all those sections divided into source of risk, threats, level of risks, what can I lose, when I'm being affected by risks, multiple facets, multiple things to be managed and to be aware of. So this is just a glimpse of what a risk posture may look like. And of course, from a standing point of an organization or a business, you would like to manage those risks, right? You would like to have all those risks within your risk appetite range. You don't want to, well, you can say, okay, I'm willing to accept the delta and move in the area of risk tolerance, but most definitely I don't want any of my risks to exceed this acceptable level. So this basically set the stage for the topic of controls and introducing controls in the environment. So far we said that cyber is complex, it has multiple touching points with business wants to stay in control, and there are multiple things to be aware of, to consider, starting from information, well, basically every artifact that is present in the environment of business and within cyber itself. So what does business wants to know when it comes to risk profile, risk, what business wants to know? And again, in a plain words, business wants to know, am I safe? Are my assets safe? And again, when we say assets, we mean people, we mean technological assets, organizational assets, every asset. How much can I lose? again, a question referring to risk profile and consequences that may result from those risks. What must I do to stay safe? These are the basic questions a business is asking. And if you ever have been reporting to your managers or leaders, I'm sure that when faced with any type of change, basically, that you wanted to get across or across the line, these were the basic questions leadership asked you, probably, because I've heard them not once and not twice. So yes, these are the basic things that business wants to know, right? So how can we respond to those questions? One of the ideas would be to introduce a notion, or not even a notion, but introduce data-driven controls. And I've highlighted data-driven controls specifically because, as it will turn out in a couple of minutes, controls still needs some kind of, or some portion of work, when they need to be implemented in the organization, but that is to come. So one thing, we should implement or introduce controls. Then we should create a control environment. We cannot leave these controls being or operating as is. We need to govern them. Then we need to build metrics, and we need to tailor suitable reporting for business needs. So in these two boxes, I already have mentioned a couple of things about controls. And I wanted just to highlight that controls are essential for reducing risk. I think it become pretty apparent, right, as so far, that purpose of controls is to reduce risks and to acceptable levels, so to that green field, right, that we've demonstrated. They are also fundamental for business to understand residual risks and the risk of the appetite for risk. Again, taking it back to the graph I've presented earlier, risk profile must be informed. It must be quantified. It must set, or it must send a tangible information of what's my risk, what can I lose, what can I do in order to manage it. Okay, so what are cybersecurity controls in fact? Well, they are sets of prioritized actions to protect an organization and data-driven from known cyber attack vectors. And since you guys took this lecture, that means you're probably interested in cybersecurity. And again, it's a triviality to say that there are so many attack vectors in current technology or in current cyberspace that's almost futile to mention it. But what this actually means is that cybersecurity controls are sets of procedures. This is a little bit simplifying, but we can think of them as a procedures deliberately tailored to address cybersecurity risks. So, yeah, they strengthen defenses and capabilities to reduce the likelihood and impact of malware attacks, security vulnerabilities being exploited, data leakages, and so forth, and so on and so forth. So basically, this is basic information. And I think it's pretty much apparent and clear. So let me give you just a couple of characteristics of cyber controls. And by the way, everything I'm going to say right now about controls, it's either driven from my professional experience or is based on one control framework. What's a control framework? Again, I will tell you a couple of words about it in a second, but just be mindful that it's presenting a notion or a set of controls just from a CIS control framework. So, as mentioned, cybersecurity controls are procedures, right? So we can have three types of those procedures. They can be either preventive, detective, or mitigating. And again, this is pretty self-explanatory. So when we are talking about, or when we are considering a preventive controls, their goal is to prevent any malicious thing or hurtful things to happen. Detective controls are those that help us to detect problems or risk, well, not even risk, more problems or instances of those problems. And of course, mitigating, limiting are those controls that are being used or applied when a risk materializes. So we faced, for instance, some kind of attack, and we need to now mitigate the effects. Second thing about control, which is absolute must to be mentioned, is that they are complex to design, monitor, and improve. And again, I will give you a glimpse of what a design looks like, what our real controls look like, but it's not straightforward thing to just say, okay, you must protect, you must close every port on your server that raise a risk. No, it's not that simple. These three elements, design, monitor, improve, give you just a hint of what's the life cycle of controls in the organization. Because even though we have control frameworks, they still need to be adapted, which is to say that need to be designed. They need to be monitored because we need to understand whether they are fit for purpose, right? And then they need to be improved. Why? Because cybersecurity changes and the environment within which organization operates is dynamic. It will become more clearer just in a second because I've got a couple of thoughts and examples of what the design, monitor, and improving process looks like. Third thing that is worthwhile mentioning, that the design process itself must be performed in such a way to keep up with frameworks, best practices, and regulations. Again, frameworks, best practices, regulations takes us to the definition that we've highlighted here of cyberspace and business. Every business and any organization performs or acts in a complex environment. This environment, well, one of the elements of the environments are regulations. And for such a big financial institution for which I have a privilege to work for, believe me that those regulations may become complicated to say the least. And at the same time, when you are introducing your controls, you need to be aware of what are those regulations, what I need to do in order to fulfill them and to adhere to them. Just to make your life easier, you need to design those controls in such a way so that they can be measured and assessed. Again, this takes us to complexities and intricacies of designing process. But then again, you need to understand whether what you have implemented so far, whether it is fit for purpose and it works. Now, all of this would be futile if you wouldn't have to communicate it to business and to the leadership. Because even though there's a lot of actions, a lot of work behind these 4 points, they, as said, they are being futile if not communicated. When leadership decides to invest in controls, they want to know, obviously, whether it was a good investment or not. Hence why we need to communicate what are whether the controls are working or not. As simple as that. Now, the 6th point is sort of a side remark because all the things I've said so far relate to cyber controls, right? Cybersecurity controls. But be mindful that there are also tech controls, business controls, many different procedures tackling problems from different areas and environments. Of course, point number 7 talks that no technology controls should be a single point of failure because there's abundance of threat actors. But I should say that basically any control should be a single point of failure. Now, these 7 points that I've introduced, of course, they have an impact on the organizational structure, right? I bet you heard of, or even you're cooperating with, or either you are working in first line of defense, second line of defense, third line of defense, right? And this is precisely what I mean. Controls or the control environment impact the organizational structure. You need to have your controls, RACEs defined and implemented on every level of your organization. You need to, of course, identify, own, and manage your cybersecurity risks, which is to say that you need to have all those artifacts in place in order to be successful with your risk management, right? Yeah, of course, you need to ensure controls are in place to mitigate issues, but that's self-explanatory and it deviates from the definition itself. Then you need to conduct independent assessment of your policies and of your controls. And this is an additional factor that organization introduces in order to be certain that control system is working. And those independent assessments, of course, are usually being conducted and provided by third-party vendors. But again, crucial due to changes in domain that are happening on a day-to-day basis. Of course, the organizational structure is being impacted to the extent that global audit controls, risk management, and governance process must be embedded in your organization. And what you need to also do is to regularly review and report your risk and controls and how they mitigate them. These are just principles for your controls management systems. These are just the principles. So yeah, I've probably by now I make you bored with all those remarks and text. So what are those controls again? What are cybersecurity controls again? And as mentioned, I'm going to use the CIS framework. This is a framework that is shared on a license. Free license. What's the name of the license when it's free? Creative Commons, of course. Yeah, so it's a Creative Commons license, and this is a basic graph or a basic view of what are those security controls according to the CIS framework. So you have your 6 basic controls, then you've got your 10 foundational and 4 organizational. So when it comes to those basic controls, you've got your controls relating to your hardware, your software, your vulnerability management, all those things, all those rudimentary things, should I say. And I will give you an example for just in 1 second. From the foundational controls, they relate to a bit more specific or more complex things like malware defenses, data protection, boundary defense. And the third group, organizational, where this relates to the weakest link in the chain, which is of course human, and they say about implementing security awareness, training, incident response, penetration tests, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to CIS controls, they've established 20 basic controls. And why I say basic? Because if I would introduce such a controls to you, as an organization leaders, you will probably ask me, what? I mean, wireless access control, so what? What does it exactly mean? So these are only level 1 controls. And on this graph, they are presented as being implementable to cloud. So probably you are familiar with all those IISs, PISs, SASs, and FASs. First one is infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and of course, functionality as a service. Those, let's say blue rectangles, dark blue rectangles, they indicate to what extent controls are implementable into these 3 domains. Now, well, in fact, this view, well, it's often called as applicability matrix. So basically, it tells you where you should implement your controls, and those rectangles indicate if it's dark blue, then it's saying that over 60% of lower level controls are supposed to be implemented in these service lines. When it's light blue, it's under 60%, between 60 and 0. If it's white, then it's 0. Now, maybe it's not the most interesting view, but please again notice how every control relates to a business model. So this is just to say that we are not going to implement all our controls like in a straightforward way, and whatever. No, we need to always adapt them to our business model. And business model is, in fact, our idea for gaining profits. So is our idea to how we want to be successful. So this is all to say that controls are connected to your special business or specific business process. And as mentioned, there are 20, in this particular framework, there are 20 level 1 controls. Let me show you just an example of the first one. They often say that this first one is the most important one. So it's just saying inventory, so the name of it is inventory and control of hardware assets. And what's its definition? Well, you need to actively manage all hardware devices on the network so that only authorized devices are given access, and unauthorized and unmanaged devices are found and prevented from gaining access. So again, if I would introduce a leadership or for that matter to anybody, such a notion of control, I would be asked, okay, so what of it? So what does it mean? We all know that we need to actively manage our assets, right? And that is why every framework came up with lower level controls. So this is just an example of what are, and just the 4 of them. This first control has 8 sub-controls underneath. But please notice, this is just saying that this level 1 control, in terms of identifying your risk or incidents, should be implemented on devices. And in this particular instance, it means that you need to utilize an active discovery tool. What does it mean, sorry? That you need to utilize an active discovery tool to identify devices connected to organizations, network, and update the hardware asset inventory. Still, something really, really basic, but it shows us that these kind of things need to be implemented when considering, of course, implementing these to the cloud environment. This should be implemented in IIS, so infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. And as mentioned, this first control has 8 in total sub-controls. But that's not always enough, right? And again, as mentioned, this is just an example of a control framework. There are many commercial control frameworks for which we have not only 1, 2, or 2 levels of controls, we have 3 or 4 or even more. The same goes here for the control number 9, and I will skip it as I think that the first control gave you a pretty good understanding of what are the levels of controls and how do they operate in the organization. But nevertheless, this 9th speaks about managing the ongoing operational use of ports, protocols, services to networks, devices in order to minimize windows of vulnerability available to attackers. Again, this is something really, really basic, but here on this matrix you can see that, well, behind that there are a couple of instances in which there's an instruction or of what it actually means and when it should be applied. And this is sorry, I want to change my view and I want to show you guys, but you can't see it, can you? No, sorry. Because I was prepared to show you what those controls look like, and believe me, in the framework you are being introduced, or the organization is being introduced with not only 9, not only 20, but with like 80 controls. And just imagine if every one of these 80 controls have level 2 controls and a specific hints on where they should be implemented. That raises and that introduces an environment which is to be governed, Okay, I'm going to return now to my presentation. So this is the basic view of what controls look like. Sorry. Okay. So I guess by now we kind of understand of what those controls are, and what I wanted to highlight is that introducing controls or implementing them in your organization is another process which is complicated. But again, once controls are being considered for implementation and are being considered to address your risks, you need to follow this process. And some of these pieces have already been mentioned. But first, you need to identify your risks. Then, knowing your frameworks, you need to adapt your controls or adapt the framework to your risk profile or your environment, which is to say that you need to design those controls once again. You need to test them, you need to report them, and you need to assure that they are functioning as tailored. So this is a basic life cycle of what what organization needs to consider when introducing controls. So you need to design them, you need to implement them. Of course, there is always a question of how I should implement them, where I need to implement them, and this I will be able to show you something. Oh, I guess not, but okay. And you need to control them. You need to continuously monitor them, which is to say that you need to check always what's the effectivity of those controls. Now, when designing those controls, your controls, I've already signaled that you need to consider best practices, you need to consider all those regulations. But so this is to say you need to know your environment within which you operate in. So when designing those controls and being aware of the environment you operate in, you need to perform a baseline of your security. Then baselining your security, that is to say that you need to know what every asset in your organization is behaving like. And this is precisely point number 2. You need, there can be, it's being narrowed down to our configuration of single devices. So there may be hundreds of different configuration checks necessary to perform, or operating systems. And this, again, I'm mentioning this just to give you an idea that introducing controls to an organization may be a pretty big task, especially when considering these factors. And of course, in order to do that, you need to understand your software and your hardware. How does it work? Who is using them? For what purpose? The best practice, which is not being always followed, but it is to have an asset inventory. So asset inventory needs to tell you about your types of your assets and how they operate. Well, maybe that's a minor point, but still. And not to give you all those boring details, you need to just be maybe aware that designing controls, it's sort of as bridging a gap, right? It's like it's something like this. You've got your controls which are provided by a control framework, right? That's on the left hand. On the right hand, you've got your corporate environment within which you operate. And you've got your couple of your Linux servers, you've got your couple of your Windows servers, you've got a couple of regulations that pertain to you. And essentially, when designing or introducing controls, you need to bridge the gap because controls set certain requirements, as you saw, for your environment to adapt to and just to be secure. And always when designing them, you need to be aware of frameworks, of course, best practices and regulations. Now, this is the first piece of control lifecycle in the organization. Not the easiest one, but still really worthwhile. Once those controls are designed, well, you need to implement them. And as mentioned, you need to have your asset inventory in order to know what kind of devices or artifacts you are using. This is, again, pretty basic stuff. Of course, the question that you would be addressing in this particular state of life cycle would be, okay, so how I need to implement them, right? Since there are those multiple controls, multiple level of controls, each can be implemented in many different manners. So how can I do it? And it's always a team of experts that would advise you on how to do it. But if you are a SME, so not that big of an organization, and you still want to become secure, you can always use free configurations. And this is what CIS is providing. Sorry, I'm not able to change the view because this, in fact, this link would take me to a specific page, which is CIS benchmarks. And basically, those guys are providing you free configurations of every device, every service, if you want to be compliant with the framework. This is the way to go, and this is the document you could use. Well, of course, you need always to monitor your controls and audit them and check whether you are being compliant still or not due to constant changes. That was the second life cycle stage, and the third one is the continuous monitoring. So as mentioned a couple of times by now, you need to constantly check whether your controls are fit to purpose or is there something that you need to amend about them. And you can do it in sort of a two-way, right? You can monitoring your controls on a regular cadence, so to speak. But this, of course, sets the ground for another procedures, sets of actions, things to be considered on a regular basis. Or you can do it via change management. So whenever introducing a new devices, artifacts, you would perform a monitoring check. And all of this takes me to one basic and very important notion when it comes to control management, which is KCI, so key control and key control indicators. Sorry. Usually referred to as KCIs, and these are metrics. So what we want to do when we are asking the question, okay, so am I safe enough? We use always KCIs, which give us a quantifiable view of to answer this basic question. All this designing, implementing, monitoring, implementing the life cycle of controls into your organization brings us back to our risk profile and the basic benefit of what control brings that they are changing the inherent risk to residual one. Don't know whether you are familiar with those two notions, but inherent risk are basically risks are basically those which were raised or were affecting your organizations in an unmanaged way, right? No controls were applied so far. Those risks were inherent to your operations. Once controls implemented, they are changing those risks to a residual state, which is to say that now you can govern your risks. And this view brings, or not even view, but this managerial approach brings a value in information to your business and to your leadership, which, yeah, and this is it. So many risk governing bodies or risk governance related leadership teams want to have something like this, want to have a view of what are my top 5 vulnerabilities, what are my risks, what can I do about it, and you know, and in terms of percentages, what's the progress, and so on and so forth. So this is what the leadership is looking for. Yeah. So, okay. So I've provided the overview of the process, but you would be asking now. So okay. So even though we've provided them, we are secure. So what's the actual benefit of introducing controls? So it's necessary to every business to establish a good metrics to make informed decision. And this takes me again to the piece I've mentioned on the controls, that they are tailored in such a way to make life of the leadership easier. So once presented, once implemented, we are able to tell or to provide information to the leadership based on which they would be able to make more informed decisions. Controls basically provide context, and if we gonna implement them in such a way that we're gonna associate good metrics, data-driven metrics, then our risk profile may be quantifiable. But this is an entirely different topic on how to quantify risks. But still, this is something that controls can bring to the table. So basically, once those controls implemented, business is able to know in which spaces is it safe, what it needs to do in order to provide safety or become safe, what it needs to do to focus, or what it needs to focus first. And yeah, sorry, I'm having a hard time with this software. And of course, what it needs to consider when making next business decisions, and what basically aspects of the business it needs to control. If you would tell to me that after listening to this, all those information were not groundbreaking, pretty basic, I would stipulate, I would say yes. But there's one thing interesting about all this environment and all those pieces I've presented, that there is large potential for automating every step I've described. So just imagine if a business could be secured, could refer to multiple or to one selected framework, and still all its actions can be or could be automated. That would be interesting, and in fact, every business I know would pay for it, would throw money at you if you would provide automation. Now, the second piece is also kinda interesting, because, as mentioned, in order to implement successful controls, you need to be aware of every intricacy of your environment that you operate within. Now, just imagine that to know your environment and every aspect of it, you can apply machine learning techniques. For instance, you can apply machine learning to read regulations, to extract obligations, and to extract instructions how to meet the obligation. Now, just imagine how many savings could that piece generate. again, if you would apply machine learning, which is doable, to compliance checking or horizon scanning, just imagine how many dollars can be saved. And, but I guess this is a perspective for another lecture or another presentation. And here I think, I don't know if I'm making it in time or not, but I'm happy to take every, sorry, yeah. If there are any questions, concerns, I'm happy to take them. If not, then thank you, stay in control.